Welcome to this webinar in the Infinite Fire series organized by the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica in Amsterdam in collaboration with the Chair for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. In my previous webinar, The Revival of Platonic Orientalism, I laid some of the foundations for what I want to talk about today. So let me just very briefly repeat what I have said in my previous webinar. I was talking about Platonic Orientalism, and this term refers to the widespread belief in antiquity and also in the Renaissance, the belief that there exists a tradition of supreme ancient wisdom that has originated somewhere in the Orient. It might have started in Egypt, it might have started in Persia, it might have started among the Hebrews or even in India, but the idea was there is an ancient wisdom started in the Orient, and it has been passed on and from sage to sage, from ancient wise men to wise men, through all kinds of traditions until it finally reaches the tradition of Plato and his followers. So there's an ancient wisdom tradition from the Orient leading up to Platonism. And this idea of Platonic Orientalism takes quite a number of different forms, depending on where the original wisdom is supposed to have originated. I talked about Gemistos Plethon last time, a Byzantine philosopher in the 15th century who argued that all the ancient wisdom had started in Persia with Zarathustra or Zoroaster. So that was a Zoroastrian interpretation of Platonic Orientalism. Then I talked about Marsilio Ficino, the great renovator and the reinventor, so to speak, of the Platonic tradition in the Renaissance. And he also believed that everything had started with Zoroaster in Persia. Finally, I talked about Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a contemporary of Ficino, a kind of intellectual prodigy who defended a quite different understanding of Platonic Orientalism, because he said it hasn't started in Persia with Zoroaster, it has started with Moses. And according to him, Moses had received not just the tables of the law on Mount Sinai, but he had also at the same time received a secret wisdom, the Kabbalah. Okay, I talked about this at great length, but one question was left hanging in the air last time, and that's the question, what then about the Hermetic variant of Platonic Orientalism? Because all these authors I just talked about, Ficino, Pico della Mirandola and a range of other people, have been described as Hermetic philosophers. I have hardly talked about Hermetism, but in this webinar I will be focusing entirely on the Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance, and I will try to show how there is indeed a Hermetic interpretation of Platonic Orientalism. So that is the topic. And in order to talk about what happens in the Renaissance with respect to Hermes, I have to start with telling you something about the history of scholarship. So I will not start in the Renaissance right away. I will start in the 20th century, talking about the history of scholarship, of Hermetism, of the Hermetic tradition. Now, the great importance of Hermetic currents of thought in the Renaissance had for a long time been overlooked by scholarship. And this changed only at the beginning of the 20th century with a seminal article published by Paul Oscar Christeller. Paul Oscar Christeller, one of the greatest scholars of Renaissance thought in the 20th century, and really a monument of scholarship, you can say. He had been working for many years in the libraries and the archives of Italy, working on materials related to Marsilio Ficino, one of the three authors I talked so much about in my previous webinar. And these labors resulted in a fundamental work that he published in 1937, Supplementum Ficinianum. You have it here, 2 volumes. This is one of these scholars, it's 37, and the whole book is written in Latin. Even the introductions are written in Latin. There were scholars at the time who were still able to write fluently in Latin. So during his researches for Supplementum Ficinianum, Christeller had made a discovery. He discovered how important the Hermetic writings actually were for Ficino. And he wrote a separate article about this topic, and that is really one of those seminal articles which start an entire new tradition of scholarship. I have it here in a later edition. And this article in English translation is called Marsilio, Ficino and Lodovico Lazzarelli, a contribution to the diffusion of Hermetic ideas in the Renaissance. It was written in Italian, but all scholars of Renaissance thought were reading Italian, so that was no problem. This was published in 1938, and with this article, Cristella started the tradition of research in Renaissance Hermetism. Now, what was his article all about? In order to explain this, I first need to tell you a few things about Hermetism in antiquity, the original Hermetic phenomenon. When we talk about Hermetic writings, then we're talking about texts that were published in the 2nd and the 3rd century of the Common Era in Alexandria, in Egypt. The contents of these texts are very interesting, both from a philosophical and a religious point of view. What we are dealing with here is philosophical and religious teachings written in the form of dialogues, which are concerned with the question of how to attain true knowledge, and the Greek word is gnosis, true knowledge about God, about the world, and about one's own spiritual essence. It is always this triangle, God, the world, and the human being, and his inner spiritual essence. Those are the topics of the Hermetic writings. And these texts are written, as I said, in dialogue form. It's usually the case that Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed author and originator of the Hermetic wisdom, is presented in dialogue with a pupil or several pupils. Usually the pupil is called Tat, T-A-T, Tat, the pupil, and the teacher is Hermes Trismegistus. There are several Hermetic writings that we still have available. We do not know how many others may have gotten lost over time. The biggest text is called the Asclepius. We no longer have it in Greek. We only have a Latin translation and just some fragments of the Greek original. This is a large text which originated in the 1st centuries, and which in this Latin translation has been very well known to intellectuals throughout the Middle Ages. And in the Renaissance, when the Hermetic writings were revived, so to speak, the Asclepius was not anything new. It was well known throughout the Middle Ages. This was not the case for the other main text that's important here, and that is the famous Corpus Hermeticum. This is a collection of separate Hermetic texts, 17 Hermetic texts, which have been put together in one collection in Byzantium in the Middle Ages, and which we now know as the Middle Ages. So this is not one text with several chapters. This is a collection of separate texts, and we do not know what the original order of the text was. Now, this, or one of the versions of this Corpus Hermeticum, emerged in 1463, or around, well, in any case, in the early 1660s of the 15th century in Byzantium. From Byzantium, it emerged in Florence. What was happening at the time was that the Ottoman armies were advancing from the east. Byzantium was overrun by the armies of the Muslims, and so many Christians were trying to save imported manuscripts from the Byzantine libraries and bring them in safety in Italy. And one of those texts was the Corpus Hermeticum. It arrived in Florence, early 60s, and it was translated by Marsilio Ficino. I will come back to this. In 1471, this translation by Ficino was printed, and later, in the 1480s of the 15th century, 3 other Hermetic texts were translated by Lodovico Lazzarelli, who's the main author of my talk today. And we will see that these writings by these translations and the writings of Lodovico Lazzarelli are very important for understanding the phenomenon of Hermetism in the Renaissance. So in summary, in the Renaissance, scholars got access to the Asclepius, which was already known for a long time. they got access to a new collection of writings, the Corpus Hermeticum. The first 14 of those had been translated by Ficino, and the final 3 translated by Lodovico Lazzarelli. Those were the Hermetic writings, and we are now going to look at what happened with them. So, Christeller, in this very important article of 1938, told the story of the Hermetic writings and how they were rediscovered in Florence in the second part of the 15th century by Ficino and Lazzarelli. That article by Christeller was the first milestone in the scholarly recovery of the Hermetic tradition. The second milestone, I have it here. It's one of my own books, I have to say. It's also, of course, owned by the library by the Ritman Library. It's an Italian book, Testi Umanistici sull'Hermetismo, with excuses for my Italian pronunciation. It was published in 1955, and this book is a direct result of the inspiration that came from Christeller's article, because he was telling all his colleagues, we have to look more closely at their Hermetic writings, and one of the results of the new scholarship in this topic was this important volume of 1955. And what you see there is that 3 Renaissance authors are highlighted here. First of all, again, Lodovico Lazzarelli. Second, an author that I will not be talking about here, Giorgio da Veneto. And thirdly, Cornelius Agrippa, who will also return later in my talk. So Lazzarelli and Agrippa are highlighted very importantly here, next to Ficino. So, in Italian scholarship since 1938, Ficino, Lazzarelli and also Agrippa were seen as important authors when you were talking about the Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. But then came the third milestone in the scholarship on Hermetism, and that is a book which I have here, published in 1964 by an English historian, Francis Yates. It is a very famous book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. 1964, it became a bestseller almost immediately. It made Francis Yates famous. It has been reprinted continuously up to the present, translated in many languages. And this is one of those books that basically create a whole new tradition of scholarship. Up to that moment, scholarship of Hermetism was restricted largely to the specialized circles of Italian Renaissance scholars. But with Francis Yates' work, their Hermetic tradition gained a kind of a mass audience, you might say. Now, Francis Yates was telling in a very readable prose, full of bubbling with enthusiasm. She was talking about the Hermetic tradition and its enormous importance in the Renaissance. And she was telling a grand narrative, you might say, of the Hermetic tradition with big names at the center. Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Agrippa, and also Giordano Bruno, the famous Italian philosopher who was tragically burned at the stake in 1600 for his heretical ideas. These were the big names in Francis Yates' narrative. Now, there is, however, a lot that is problematic about the big book that Francis Yates published, and her work has dominated our perception of Renaissance Hermetism. But in this talk today, I will be arguing that most of what Francis Yates said, unfortunately, was wrong, and that our Hermetic tradition has a very different shape from what you would think reading her work. First of all, we have already seen in the previous webinar that Ficino was not actually a Hermetist, as Francis Yates argued. He was arguing that Zoroaster and not Hermes was at the origin of the great wisdom tradition. Pico della Mirandola, another hero of Francis Yates' story of the Hermetic tradition, was not a Hermetist either. He said that Moses and not Hermes was at the origin. So in both cases there is something wrong here. Agrippa, another big name I will come back to later. Finally, Giordano Bruno was highlighted in Francis Yates' book. The whole second part of her book is devoted to Bruno, and she says Bruno was the Hermetic philosopher of the Renaissance, of the 16th century. But actually, Hermes is mentioned by Bruno from time to time, but you cannot actually call Bruno an Hermetic philosopher in any strict sense. Interestingly, and And that is a point which will be of particular importance for the story I'm telling today. Interestingly, Lodovico Lazzarelli, who had been central to Cristella's work, to the Testi Umanistici sull'Hermetismo of 1955, Lazzarelli, who was so central in Italian scholarship, was completely marginalized by Francis Yates. He seems to have vanished from the stage. You find him in footnotes here and there, but he plays no role in Francis Yates' narrative. Well, why is this? Francis Yates, in this seminal work, was proposing a very clear agenda. And this agenda has three different parts that I would like to emphasize. First of all, according to Francis Yates, the Hermetic tradition of the Renaissance had to be at the origin of the process of modernization and scientific progress that was had finally led to the modern world. And she wanted to show the relevance of Hermetism. She wanted to show this is not a forgotten tradition that is of little interest for modern people. No, actually, in order to understand how our own modern world, how modern science emerged, we have to look at the Hermetic tradition. So this is how she was trying to make this topic relevant for modern readers. Thanks to Francis Yates, and we really have to be grateful to her, thanks to her, the topic of the importance of Hermetic and related currents in the scientific revolution has been put on the agenda. Nowadays, historians of science will give serious attention to the role of, for instance, alchemy, natural magic, or astrology in the history of the scientific revolution. It used to be the case in Francis Yates' time that all these topics were seen as unscientific pseudoscience with no relation to real science. Since Francis Yates and up to the present, this is different. Scholars of science, historians of science, will give serious attention to Hermetic and related currents as part of the scientific revolution. So in this case, in this respect, Francis Yates made a very important point. However, she was exaggerating, because she was essentially claiming that modern science and modernization in general had emerged, so to speak, from the Hermetic tradition. That's a bit too much. The Hermetic tradition is important, but it is certainly not the core and the source of modernization and scientific progress. Another problem is that if you look at the phenomenon of the Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance, and we will see examples of this, there's quite a lot to be found there which has no relation to science and modernization at all. So this very strong focus of Francis Yates on modernization and scientific progress is central to our narrative, but quite problematic when you actually try to analyze the Hermetic tradition. First of all, Francis Yates had an agenda of showing the relevance of the Hermetic tradition for science, modernization, progress. The second point of her agenda was that she wanted to emphasize that Hermetism was a magical tradition. For her, Hermetism was magic, because this allowed her to make the spectacular assertion that actually magic stood at the origin of science. Now, this was an extremely controversial statement which made for much of the fascination of her book, because at the time that she wrote it, that she published it in 1964, the general assumption was that magic and science were opposite, had nothing to do with each other. But Francis Yates said, actually, the Hermetic form of magic, Hermetism as a magical tradition, was actually at the origin of science. Science had emerged from magic. Well, that was a controversial, very controversial statement, and this fascinated her readers. However, there are problems with this assertion as well, because if you actually look closely at the Corpus Hermeticum, which was at the origin, at the center of her argument, the Corpus Hermeticum, translated by Ficino, published in 1471, this whole magical tradition was supposed to have emerged from that translation. But if you look at the Corpus Hermeticum, then you find no magic there. There's nothing that by any definition could be seen as magic that you can find in the Corpus Hermeticum. The only passages that look somewhat like magic occur not in the Corpus Hermeticum, but in that other text, the Asclepius. This big text that had been known throughout the Middle Ages in Latin. And there we find very few short passages in which Hermes Trismegistus is praising the art of drawing down the powers of the gods into the statues of the Egyptian deities. Now, this idea of drawing down divinities or higher powers into statues and then venerating them, that was seen as idolatry by Christians, by Christian theologians. That was unacceptable. And St. Augustine had condemned those passages very strongly and said an author, Hermes Trismegistus, who says such things cannot be a source of authority for Christians. So these were very controversial passages, but these few passages, just a few chapters in the Asclepius, are the only things that could be constructed as magic in the whole Hermetic literature. Now, interestingly, if you read Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates, then you find that Francis Yates completely misleads her readers, I have to say so, because she hardly quotes the Corpus Hermeticum at all when she talks about her statement that Hermetism is magic. She's quoting only from the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum 1. She quotes that about 30 times. The whole rest of the Corpus Hermeticum is hardly ever quoted or referred to at all, but the Asclepius is quoted about 110 times, almost four times as much as the rest. And circa half of those references are always again and again to those few chapters about idolatry, about the making of gods or the attraction of powers into the statues. So Francis Yates is highlighting these few passages as representative of their Hermetic writings as a whole. And this is problematic because she is arguing that this whole magical tradition started with the translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, but actually there's nothing magical in that Corpus Hermeticum. And if you look for magic in the Hermetic writings, you find them in a text that was well known to intellectuals throughout the Middle Ages in the Asclepius, and that was not any big news at all to intellectuals in the Renaissance. So in short, what was new in the 15th century, the Corpus Hermeticum, was not magical. And what was magical, those passages in the Asclepius, was not new. So this basically messes up the entire narrative of Francis Yates. She is highlighting artificially Hermetism as a magical tradition, although actually it was hardly magical at all. This is the second part. So first, Hermetism as a force of progress and modernization is problematic. Second, Hermetism as a magical tradition is problematic. These are the basis, so to speak, of the whole grand narrative that Francis Yates is trying to convince our readers about. Finally, and this is my third point, Francis Yates needed some big names for her grand narrative in order to show how important the Hermetic tradition was for modernization and progress. She needed big names, and she selected Ficino, Pico, and the famous heretic Bruno for her narrative. Well, I already said there were no Hermetists. They were not really Hermetists. Interestingly enough, the real Hermetist, as we will see, was this figure I already mentioned several times, Lodovico Lazzarelli, and Lazzarelli was completely marginalized in Francis Yates' book. He has vanished into some footnotes. Why? Well, for very simple reasons. Lazzarelli was too minor, he was too unknown, he was not a big name that you could hang a whole grand narrative on. And further, it is very clear that Lazzarelli had no interest in science or in magic. So he simply did not fit the agenda of Francis Yates, and therefore she marginalized him. Well, the conclusion is that Francis Yates removed the real Hermetists from her story. She replaced them by authors who were not really Hermetists, but who fitted her story of magic leading to scientific progress. And for decades and decades, up to very recent time, to the present, countless scholars and readers have adopted Francis Yates' narrative as if it was, so to speak, the gospel about the Hermetic tradition. Actually, we have to look at the Hermetic tradition in a very different way. We have to say goodbye to this narrative and come to think of a more accurate picture of Hermetism. And I'm going to try to paint the outlines of an alternative history of Hermetism in the Renaissance in the rest of my webinar. So let me summarize once again, just in a few sentences, what I've said so far. From Cristella's seminal article of 1938 up to Francis Yates in 1964, Italian scholars of the Renaissance were focusing very strongly on two central figures in the recovery or the revival of Hermetism in the Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino, translator of the first 14 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum, published in 1471, and Lodovico Lazzarelli, who had edited or had translated the final 3 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum. Those were the central figures. Then, with Francis Yates, suddenly everything changes. New figures come on the stage next to Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno. They are presented as Hermetists. And Lodovico Lazzarelli, who was so central in all the earlier scholarship, has suddenly vanished. Now, I will be arguing that actually Lodovico Lazzarelli was the key figure in the revival of Renaissance Hermetism, even more so in many respects than the great Ficino himself. Now, who was Lodovico Lazzarelli? He was born in 1447 in a small Italian town, San Severino. He showed a very early talent for languages, and he was given an excellent education in humanist studies. So he was learning Greek and Latin, and from an early age on he was studying the classical Greek and Latin authors, writers from antiquity. That is what he did, and he embarked very early on a career as a poet. Already as a child he was writing poems, and he wanted to achieve fame and glory as a poet. He began when he was still quite young to make his living as a private tutor with wealthy families. That was an occupation that was quite normal for young humanists at the time. In 1468, when he was 19 years old, he was crowned with laurels by Emperor Frederick III, who was in the neighborhood, friends of Lazzarelli, who had good connections in high circles, introduced him to the emperor. Lodovico Lazzarelli was given the chance to recite a poem of his own, and the emperor crowned him with laurels. And up to the end of his life, Lazzarelli and his family were very proud of the fact that he was a poet laureate. So that happened when he was already in 1468, when he was 19 years old. And so you see that this is a young humanist who is set on his way to become a poet. He wrote a whole series of works that I will not be talking about here, a book on the images of the pagan gods, and his most important poetic work, the Fasti Christiani Religionis, the holy days of the Christian religion, modeled after the Fasti by Ovid. All these poetic works are very important and interesting, but not central to my story today. What is important is that in 1473, Lodovico Lazzarelli moved to Rome, where he becomes a member of the Humanist Poets Academy, the Roman Academy. And there are reasons to assume that his career as a poet did not evolve as successfully as he had been hoping. Well, however that may be, in 1481 he decided to put an end to his poetic career, and this was due to the event that changed his life forever. His meeting in 1481 with a very strange personality, a strange figure, an apocalyptic preacher with the name of Giovanni da Correggio. Giovanni da Correggio, the second central figure next to Lazzarelli in the story that I will be telling here. Giovanni da Correggio is an enigmatic figure. We do not know that much about him. He seems to have come from a rather wealthy family, probably as a bastard son, so who had money but was not recognized entirely by his family. But in spite of the fact that he had noble backgrounds, he has spent most of his life wandering through Italy, begging for his bread. So he chose a life of voluntary poverty, begging for bread, and preaching to the people about the need to convert themselves in anticipation of the end of times that was coming soon. So this was a wandering preacher, and there were more people like those wandering around in Italy at the time. But Correggio attracted quite a lot of attention by his strange behavior, and from modern perspectives I think that it is fair to say that he probably was a little bit crazy. So in any case, it is a strange figure. We have some texts that were published by him, and they are extremely ponderous in the way that they talk about the coming of the end of times and so on. Well, in any case, Giovanni da Correggio made his appearance in Rome in 1481. He was preaching there, and one of the bystanders was this poet Lodovico Lazzarelli. He was listening to Correggio, and by all accounts he was swept off his feet by him. Everything indicates that Correggio was a charismatic personality who could make a big impression on his audiences, very fluid speaker, and Correggio was completely Lazzarelli was completely overwhelmed by him. From that moment on, Lazzarelli decided to move away from his pursuit of fame and glory as a poet and steer his way from profane poetry to the spiritual quest for wisdom and truth. So he abandoned his career as a poet and became a spiritual or mystical seeker, you might say. He followed Giovanni da Correggio as his master, as his guru, we might almost say nowadays. And 1 year later, in 1482, we see how much he admired da Correggio. He gave him a very beautiful present that he had made, a beautiful manuscript which is nowadays preserved in the library of Viterbo in Italy, the Viterbo manuscript. And it contains all the Hermetic writings that were known at the time. First of all, it contains a complete transcript of Marsilio Ficino's translation of the first 14 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum, the so-called Pimander. Secondly, it contains the complete Asclepius, that Latin text that had survived through the Middle Ages. And third of all, it contains the so-called Definitiones Asclepii, as he calls them, and these were the 3 final treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum. In some manner, we do not know exactly how, Lazzarelli had discovered an independent, a separate manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum in Greek, and this manuscript was more complete than a manuscript that Ficino had been using. It contained those 3 extra treatises. They were translated by Lazzarelli in this manuscript, and only later, after his death in 1507, have they been published for the first time in an important edition by the French Hermetist Symphorien Champier. So this manuscript, beautifully made, he offers as a gift to his teacher, his guru, Giovanni da Correggio, and all the 3 main texts of the Hermetica are preceded by prefaces written by Lazzarelli himself. And these show the enormous impact that the Hermetica had made on this apparently very devout Christian thinker, Lazzarelli. I will read the beginning of the first preface to you. And before doing that, let me point out a very significant detail in the first sentences, and that is that Lazzarelli addresses his master Correggio as Giovanni Mercurio. Now, Mercurius is the Latin translation of Hermes. So, here Lazzarelli is addressing his master as Hermes. In a certain way, Correggio is equivalent with Hermes himself for Lazzarelli, and we will see how significant that is. So let me read this passage from the first preface by Lazzarelli. It goes as follows. Dear teacher, dearly beloved Father Giovanni Mercurio, I have become so absorbed in the study of the divine books of Hermes Trismegistus, and also in the most holy words of Moses and the prophets, and most of all in those of Jesus Christ our Saviour, that all other writings, whether of ancients or of moderns, have completely lost their appeal to me and make me sick to my stomach. I just interrupt for a moment here. This is another way of saying that all the classical writings, all the classical authors that he had been studying as a humanist are discarded completely. They make him sick to his stomach. This is a way of saying that Lazzarelli completely abandons his earlier humanist training as a poet focused on the classical heritage of Greece and Rome. I continue. He continues talking about the truly important writings of Hermes and the Bible, and he said about them, "For they are all sitting at one table, and with friendly faces they serve their fellow dinner guests the fragrant dishes of the gods and their refreshing drinks. Here is the food of the angels, here is the substance of God, which attends to everyone's will. Here is prepared the bread of heaven that has in it all delight and all that is sweet to the taste. Here is the fountain of the water of life that brings up to eternal life. Here is the consonant harmony of the words of God that reach into the soul. Here the life-bestowing apples of the tree of life offer themselves to accommodate all wishes. Here finally is the fullness of the garden of all delights. And any man that will taste of them will be able to understand himself." It's an important thing. Understanding oneself, that means gnosis, self-knowledge. Anyone who will taste of them will be able to understand himself, to free himself from his ties with the material world, break free from the motions of the celestial harmony, escape from the light of obscurity, transcend the seven spheres, and thus to join the ranks of the powers. All those, however, who devote themselves to other authors and scriptures, what else do they find but the fleeting food of Tantalus, the substance of sin, a bread devised to draw down souls, a cup of forgetfulness, opinions that are at variance amongst themselves, the deadly apples of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in one word, all the deadly lures of hell. Having become entangled in them, man who once had existed supreme above the harmony has fallen into the harmony of the world and has become a slave of death. So, very strong separation here. The true message, the spiritual message of the Hermetic writings and the Bible against all the other writings, all the profane writings, which only lead to hell. Finally, he concludes, "So farewell, Aeonian Parnassus, for henceforth I will sedulously celebrate Mount Zion. Farewell, well of the Helicon, the river of the Muses, for henceforth I will be refreshed by the crystal clear waters of that other well, which at the time of regeneration gush forth copiously in the heavenly city of Jerusalem, descending from the sky, from the throne of God and of the Lamb." So you see this flowery poetic language in which Lazzarelli is celebrating the supreme wisdom of the Hermetic writings, which are completely consonant with the biblical writings according to him, and completely separates them from all other profane worldly texts and traditions. I will still stay a bit further with this first preface by Lazzarelli, because it's very interesting that further on in that text he actually criticizes the great Marsilio Ficino, and what he says there is very important in our story. So let me read that passage as well. Lazzarelli writes, "So, while I read through all the books of Hermes that I possibly could as a student of true wisdom, I did not omit the preface by Marsilio Ficino to those books that he recently translated into Latin, and which I am now sending you, with these others, as a token of my esteem. In it, I found many things that were quite elegantly, gracefully and eloquently written about our Hermes, things which filled me with love for the translator of the work, Marsilio, to a wonderful degree, because he had celebrated your father and my grandfather." That's a way of saying that Hermes is apparently the father of Correggio, and therefore the grandfather of Lazzarelli. I will come back to that. "Because Ficino had celebrated your father and my grandfather, Hermes, with so many excellent praises, although the tongues of all the scholars together could not express and do justice to the merits of this truly perfect and godly man. One thing only I considered incorrectly said in the beginning of the preface by Ficino, namely what he tells us later generations about the lifetime of this Hermes. For Trismegistus did not live after the time of Moses, as Ficino tells us there, but rather a long time before, as can clearly be gathered from the books of Diodorus, that is Diodorus Siculus. For in his description of the dynasties of Egypt, Diodorus Siculus relates how first the gods and then man reigned in Egypt. And it is a known fact that this Hermes Trismegistus lived among the gods in the time of the gods. And it is well established that these gods were perfect and true men and sages. But Moses, as is quite clear from the sacred scriptures and many records of the ancients, Moses lived in the period when the pharaohs reigned in Egypt. People who are neither divine nor true and perfect men, but can scarcely be called human at all. For no one can be called human if he has not reached the true and proper form and force of a man, that is to say, the light, the life, the mind, the word of God, and judgment and dominion over all things in the world. Such as Hermes has not only reached himself, but has also abundantly poured forth to others in his sacred writings and teachings, and in his divine Crater. Crater is a reference to the fourth treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, which has that title. So, what we find here, in this criticism of Ficino, is that he says, no, Ficino says that Moses was first and then Hermes came, at least in this preface. I said in the previous webinar that actually Ficino later on very quickly decided that actually Zoroaster was older, okay? But Laterelli is disagreeing with Ficino here, and he says no, Hermes was much older than Moses, much older, so the origin is in Hermes. So what we find here is an example of an Hermetic understanding, an Hermetic interpretation of Platonic Orientalism. Not a Zoroastrian understanding like Plethon and Ficino, not a Mosaic understanding like Pico, but here we find a real example of somebody who says Hermes is the source, the origin of the true wisdom. That is where everything started. So here we have a Hermetic interpretation of Platonic Orientalism. In the second preface, in this Viterbo manuscript by Laterelli, we read, among other things, that Laterelli is convinced that he has been born again, he has been regenerated, born again, through the agency of Correggio. Correggio has initiated him, or has really caused him literally to be reborn as a new man, and therefore, for Correggio is his spiritual father. Correggio himself is in a certain way the son of Hermes. So Hermes is the spiritual grandfather. So you have Hermes, Correggio, Laterelli. Okay, so much about this Viterbo manuscript. Much more could be said about it. It's a fascinating text, but I will move on to a central event that happened a few years after this manuscript was written, on Palm Sunday 1484. And this is the spectacular entrance that Giovanni da Correggio made in Rome on that day. This is described by Laterelli in a text, the Epistola Enoch, the letter of Enoch. And what happened was really spectacular. Correggio turned up with a couple of servants on black horses. He thundered through the streets of Rome, Palm Sunday, early in the morning, and he drew a whole crowd of people who thought, who is this man? So he drew an audience. Once he was sure that there was an audience, he went outside the city gates again, and he put on new clothes, and he clothed himself as Jesus Christ. He put on a white linen mantle. He put a crown of thorns on his head, and he mounted a donkey. And he proceeded to actually enter the gates of Rome, looking exactly like Jesus Christ had looked when he entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So he was repeating, so to speak, the entrance of Jesus Christ into to the city of Jerusalem, which preceded, as we all know from the biblical narrative, his crucifixion. We do not know whether Correggio thought or anticipated that he as well might be killed after this entrance. We do not know this, but he repeated the entrance of Jesus by enacting the same thing, looking like Jesus, sitting on a donkey, with a crown of thorns on his head. And over this crown of thorns there was a silver-plated disc in the form of a crescent moon, and it had a very significant text, which I will read for you. It said, "This is my servant Pimander, whom I have chosen." Now this word Pimander has come up several times already. Let me explain it. Pimander is the title of Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, and this title is derived from the from the spiritual figure that is central to the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum, because in this first treatise we read how Hermes Trismegistus in a trance vision meets a spiritual being who calls himself Poimandres. Now Poimandres was written by Ficino as Pimander, but Poimandres appears in the Corpus Hermeticum as a manifestation of God himself, as a being of light who teaches the true wisdom, Poimandres. So here on this disc which was fixed over the crown of thorns of Correggio when he was entering Rome, it said, "This is my servant Pimander, whom I have chosen. This Pimander is my supreme and waxing child, in whom I am well pleased, to cast out demons and proclaim my judgment and truth to the heathen. Do not hinder him, but hear and obey him with all fear and veneration. Thus speaks the Lord your God and Father of every talisman of all the world, Jesus of Nazareth." So what does this mean? Well, this passage is clearly modeled after the biblical description in the gospel narrative, which refers to the descent of the Holy Spirit on Jesus at his baptism in the River Jordan. But there are also all kinds of reference to the Hermetic text, including the Tabula Smaragdina, the famous text of alchemy. So specialists will recognize all kinds of references in this text. But the most important thing for us is that it's very clearly said here that Correggio is actually Pimander or Poimandres, and he is also in a certain way Christ. So Correggio, Christ, and Poimandres, the manifestation of God, are identified with one another by Lazzarelli and probably by Correggio himself at the time. Well, after dressing himself up like Jesus and mounting his donkey, actually Correggio entered the city gates of Rome. He walked through the streets, followed by his servants, and it was staged very cleverly because this was Palm Sunday, as I said, and people were coming out of the churches holding palm leaves in their hands, because it was usual that people got handed palm leaves during the church service. So they come out with those palm leaves, they come out on the street, they see this strange figure looking like Jesus on a donkey, they say, "What is going on?" And they follow him with the palm leaves in their hands. So it looks exactly like the entrance of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. So on every street corner, Correggio halts and gives a long speech and a sermon preaching about the end of time and the need to repent and so on and so forth. And he finally reaches St. Peter, and according to Lazzarelli's story, he is actually allowed by the guard to enter the St. Peter while the service was still going on, enter the St. Peter, getting off his donkey, and supposedly he walked up to the altar and gave prayers to God, and that was the end of his performance. Well, there is reason to assume that this actually didn't happen. We know from independent evidence that at one point Correggio was thrown into prison, and we may assume that rather than entering the St. Peter, he was actually arrested and thrown into prison, and that this was maybe an aspect of the performance that Lazzarelli did not want to talk about. Anyway, this was the spectacular entrance of Correggio as the Hermetic Christ into Rome. Well, after that, for some time, we lose track of Lazzarelli and of Correggio. We know that at one point after 1486, Lazzarelli, at least, we find his traces again, and we find him in Naples. And he spent a long time in Naples, where he seems to have built up a kind of a reputation as an exorcist, who was healing the sick by casting out the demons. So Lazzarelli, the poet, has been transformed into a kind of religious figure. And then in 1492 to 1494, in that period, early 90s, he writes his most important work, the Crater Hermetis. And that is an incredibly important work that is central to the importance of Lazzarelli to Renaissance Hermetism. It has remained in manuscript until after Lazzarelli's death in 1500, and it was first printed in a strongly revised version by humanist Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples in 1505. And I have it here. This is one of the key publications of the Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. I have it here, the 1505 edition by Lefebvre d'Étaples of all the Hermetic writings, the authentic ancient Hermetic writings, but also the Crater Hermetis by Lodovico Lazzarelli. 1505, printed after Lazzarelli himself was already dead. Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis is a small masterpiece. It is clearly the work of a very gifted writer. It is extremely well written, beautiful Latin, and I would say that it is probably the purest example of Christian Hermetism in the entire Renaissance. It's a very important text. What is it about? It is very closely modeled on the dialogue form that we see in the original Hermetic writings, but here Lazzarelli himself places himself in the role of the initiator, of Hermes Trismegistus. He takes the role of the person who is initiating his pupils into the true Hermetic wisdom, and his pupils are two historical persons. King Ferdinand I of Aragon and Sicily, who was actually residing in Naples, where he had his court, and his servant and first minister, the poet and astrologer Giovanni Pontano. These are historical figures who really existed, and we can assume that Lazzarelli wrote this text hoping that he would be able to offer it to King Ferdinand of Aragon and Sicily at the court. He never succeeded in this. But in the text we find this powerful Renaissance ruler, King Ferdinand I, and his servants being initiated into the true Hermetic wisdom by Lodovico Lazzarelli. You can think all kinds of things about this. Did Lazzarelli really think it was safe to, as an unknown poet, to place himself on a superior level from such a powerful king as Ferdinand I, who would not hesitate to put him in prison if he didn't like it? Well, we do not know. But this is what we find in the text. King Ferdinand and his pupil are being initiated into the way of how to attain true felicity, true happiness. And the answer that Lazzarelli gives is we can only find true happiness through attaining perfect gnosis, perfect knowledge of ourselves and knowledge of God. This happens through a process of spiritual regeneration or rebirth, through which we finally attain unity with God himself. That is what the text is all about. Now, the text is very interesting because it shows very clearly that Ficino, that Lazzarelli had understood the message of the Corpus Hermeticum very adequately, actually. And this is interesting, because if you compare it with Ficino himself, the great Ficino, who was presented as an Hermetic philosopher by Francis Yates, if you actually read Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, then you find out, embarrassingly enough, you might almost say, that Ficino did not really understand the text very well. You can show this at many examples. He did not get the message of gnosis as central to the Hermetic teachings and a lot of other things as well. It looks as if Ficino overlooked the true message of the Hermetica. Interestingly, Lazzarelli did get it. He shows a much more acute and adequate understanding of what the Hermetic writers actually wanted to teach their readers. Lazzarelli understood, contrary to Ficino, that the Hermetic message is all about a spiritual process of ascent from the material world to the realm of divinity, culminating in a supra-rational salvational gnosis, direct spiritual vision of the divine, and also that this implies the acquisition of superhuman divine powers. So if you attain unity with God, then you gain powers. And we will see what this means. At the very beginning of the Crater Hermetis, we find a very significant statement, which I will read. Lazzarelli writes, "He that was Pimander in the mind of Hermes has deigned to take up residence within me as Jesus Christ." And then come some other sentences. "He that was Pimander in the mind of Hermes has deigned to take up residence within me as Jesus Christ." So here we see the same point again. Poimandres, whom we encounter in the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum and as the manifestation of God who speaks to Hermes, this Poimandres, or Pimander, is actually none other than Christ himself. They are one and the same. And this Pimander alias Christ, you might say, has now taken up residence in Lazzarelli's own heart, and that is why he is able to preach the truth to his pupils. Now we begin to see the outlines of the message that we find in Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis. What he says is that first in ancient times in Egypt, the truth was revealed to a pagan Egyptian sage or wise man, Hermes Trismegistus. And the truth was revealed to him by Poimandres, this mysterious being of light, the manifestation of the true God, who is described in the first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum. Lazzarelli says here, and that is revolutionary, nobody had ever said such a thing before. He says that, well, this Poimandres is no one else than Christ. Christ, the second person of the Trinity. They are one and the same being. Then, of course, this Son of God, Christ himself, incarnated as Jesus Christ. So first he reveals himself as Poimandres to a pagan sage, then he incarnates as Jesus Christ. And Poimandres, alias Christ, has now illuminated Lazzarelli's mind and has caused him to be reborn as a spiritual being. That is what he is saying. Now, the Crater Hermetis, I could talk for hours about it. It contains long passages of very interesting and creative biblical interpretation and a whole range of poetic hints, because Lazzarelli remains a poet, so he puts some quite impressive hints in his text. But all of it leads up to the final revelation of the Hermetic mystery according to Lazzarelli. And this is the mystery of spiritual generation, spiritual birth or rebirth, regeneration. And this revolves around a very original, creative, unheard of interpretation of the idolatrous passages in the Asclepius. I talked about them earlier, those passages in which Hermes Trismegistus describes how the ancient Egyptians drew down the powers of the gods into the statues in the temples. And this was rejected and condemned by Augustine as idolatry and unacceptable. Interestingly, precisely these dangerous magical passages are central to Lazzarelli's text. I cannot go into all the technical details here, but the point that Lazzarelli is making is the following. Poimandres revealed the truth to Hermes Trismegistus. However, Hermes was still a pagan, and because he was living before the true revelation of Jesus Christ, in Jesus Christ himself, he wasn't capable of understanding precisely what Poimandres was revealing to him, and therefore he lapsed into idolatry in the Asclepius. So Lazzarelli actually agrees with Augustine in saying, yes, these passages are idolatrous, they are wrong. They show that Hermes Trismegistus had a lot of wisdom, but he was not perfect yet, because he lived before the revelation of Christ. So Hermes was still a pagan and still misunderstood part of the true message. Then Poimandres, as I said, was incarnated as Jesus Christ, and only after that event, Lazzarelli says, has it become possible for people to really understand what the message is all about. So only Christians are able to understand what the Hermetic message is all about. Christianity and Hermetism belong together. From a Christian perspective, we understand the true meaning of the Hermetic revelation. If a man is literally reborn from God, regenerated, then he attains perfect gnosis, Lazzarelli says. So there's a process of rebirth. It is not just that a human being is birthed by bodily generation, by the sexual act, but there is a kind of analogous spiritual parallel to that. After having been born as a bodily being, the human being can be reborn as a spiritual being. And that is what the Hermetic message is all about. By this process of regeneration or rebirth, we become one with God himself. We gain perfect knowledge of ourselves as a divine being and of the essence of God, God himself, and thereby, Lazzarelli says, we come to participate in the very powers of creation of God himself, and therefore we can do something then that only God can do, and that is to create souls. And what Lazzarelli is actually saying is that, going back to these idolatrous passages in the Asclepius, what we read there is that Hermes was praising the practice of drawing down souls into statues. But actually, when he had perfectly understood it, as we understand it now from a Christian perspective, he says, then he would have known that it's not necessary to draw down souls from anywhere because we can create them ourselves. That is what Hermes had misunderstood. But if you have to have correct understanding of the message, then you know that you can learn to become one with God, participate in the very powers of creation that are divine, and therefore you can create souls by yourself. You can generate new souls. You can cause other souls to be born. Now, this is the big mystery that Lazzarelli reveals to the king and Pontano, and at the very end of the Crater Hermetis, the king and Pontano are completely excited by this. They want to gain this knowledge. They want to be reborn. They want to unify themselves with God, and they are asking Lazzarelli, how can we do it? Please tell us how to do it. But Lazzarelli, so to speak, looks at his watch and he says, guys, we have been talking far too long now. We have to postpone this to another time. So that is where the crater ends. What Lazzarelli does not reveal is that in all likelihood, if he would have wanted to initiate the king and Pontano into true gnosis, then this would probably have happened through the agency of Correggio. So you can imagine that if the crater would have had a sequel in which the two pupils were actually initiated into the true wisdom, then at one point Correggio would have stepped on the stage and he would actually have caused the two pupils to be reborn. Because again, Correggio, according to Lazzarelli, was no one else than Poimandres, and Christ returned to earth. Correggio is not mentioned in the crater, and we can only, from what we know from other sources about the Lazzarelli's message, we can assume that this is what he actually had in mind. So, what we find here in the Crater Hermetis is a thoroughly Christian reinterpretation of the Hermetic message, in which it is claimed that only Christians can really understand what the Hermetic message is all about. And what we also see here, and that is very significant, is a process of progress. And that is significant because the original forms of Platonic Orientalism that we saw in Ficino, Pico and other authors, they always assumed that in very ancient times the perfect supreme wisdom was revealed. After that, there has been a process of decline. We have lost touch with the true wisdom. We have forgotten part of it. We have to find our way back. But there has been a process of decline from the perfect wisdom of the ancient Orient to our present times. Interestingly, Lazzarelli gives a progressive interpretation of the ancient wisdom discourse. And that is very innovative and very creative, because he says that yes, everything started with Hermes Trismegistus in Egypt, but it was not perfect yet at that time. It's only after the incarnation of Poimandres as Christ that we have really come to understand what the Hermetic message was all about. And now that in the person of Giovanni da Correggio, Hermetism and Christianity have come to be united, so to speak, in one person, we get even further. So for him, there's a process of progress from the pagan revelation of Hermes to the Christian reinterpretation through Jesus Christ, to the unification of Hermetism and Christianity in his own time in the person of Correggio. That is a new, innovative, creative interpretation that is typical for Lazzarelli, and which makes him very different from the other forms of Platonic Orientalism that we have been talking about. This is what I wanted to say about Lazzarelli. Let me just finish in a few sentences the end of his life. He never managed to offer the Crater Hermetis to King Ferdinand I of Aragon and Sicily, to his great frustration, no doubt. He returned at one point to San Severino, where, according to the stories, we have a biography written by his brother. According to the stories, he lived a kind of a saintly life in which he was still casting out demons as a kind of exorcist. And he apparently died in a saintly manner after a very impressive dream that he shared with his brother. They died almost at the same time, and he foresaw his own death and the death of his brother. And the whole description is that of a saintly person who has really attained true religious wisdom. That was the end of Lazzarelli's life in 1500. So what I've been saying so far is that Lodovico Lazzarelli is a real Hermetist in every sense of the word in the Renaissance. He believes that the true wisdom has actually started with Hermes Trismegistus in ancient times, and from there on the wisdom tradition has been carried on. So not from Zoroaster, not from Moses, but really from Hermes. And also it is clear that if you read his Crater Hermetis, it's very clear that he had studied the Hermetic writings extremely carefully and he understood them. He had really understood the real message. Contrary, as I said, to a Ficino who seems to have missed most of what it was all about, at least in his writings about Hermetism. So Lazzarelli is the real Hermetist. But if this is true, then and Lazzarelli is the real Hermetist rather than the great Ficino, Pico, Bruno and other great names, does this mean that Hermetism is actually a minor, smaller tradition? Haven't I actually been saying that this great Hermetic tradition that Francis Yates is talking about is now shrinking to something very small, represented by an interesting but minor figure? Not at all. Not at all. It's rather the case that we still need a lot of work to do to uncover the real Hermetic tradition. There is much more if we start looking in the direction I've been suggesting here. There's much more than we know, and a lot of research still has to be done. We can look, for instance, at a whole range of names that also do not figure very much in Francis Yates' narrative. For example, Giorgio da Veneto, who was already mentioned, who is used in the Hermetic text quite a lot. A French scholar, Foix de Candale, I have a book by him here, Mercuria Trismegisti, Francesco Flussatis Candale, Foix de Candale. He's a very important, interesting French Hermetic scholar and thinker that we really do not know that much about. And there are quite a number of other names that could be mentioned. All of them have to be explored. I will just focus here to finish this webinar on one very important example of the continuation of Lazzarellian Hermetism in the 16th century. And this figure is Cornelius Agrippa. Cornelius Agrippa, who lived from 1486 to 1535 or 36. And he's a great name. He gets a whole chapter in Francis Yates' book, but Francis Yates sees him as a kind of more medieval figure and she's not very positive about him. But actually Agrippa is a clear example of a continuation of the lineage that starts with Lazzarelli. He was you could say, a wandering German humanist who was known widely in his own time for his interest in the so-called occult sciences. Occult sciences is a problematic term, so I'm using it with some caution here. He's the author of a lot of works that I will not talk about here. For example, a treatise on the nobility and preeminence of the female sex, which is really a kind of a very early modern feminist classic. He has written a very large work of skepticism on the uncertainty and vanity of all the arts and sciences. None of them lead to certain knowledge, according to him. But the most important book for us, and the book which also made him most famous, is a large 3-volume De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres. And that means 3 books of occult philosophy. I have it here. 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa, so you see his face here on the title page. And this book has become famous and is generally recognized as a kind of a summary statement, a summa, an encyclopedic work on these so-called occult sciences of the Renaissance. He basically speaks about all the traditional sciences that had been passed on from antiquity through the Middle Ages and had reached the Renaissance. And this book on occult philosophy has earned him a quite undeserved reputation as a black magician. After Agrippa's death, or even during his life already, people thought that he was in league with the devil. He had a black dog, poodle, that he called Monsieur, and people thought that this actually was the devil. And this picture of Agrippa with his black dog was actually the devil, has survived even so far as into Goethe's Faust, the great tragedy by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, where Faust himself gets in touch with Mephistopheles, the devil, and the devil first appears to him in the form of a black dog. And there are all kinds of other references to Agrippa there. Okay, but so the reputation of Agrippa as a black magician is completely undeserved, because in fact he was an extremely pious Christian, and his interest in the occult sciences is motivated by a very sincere search for Christian salvation, you might say. And we will see how that works for him. In his great book on 3 books on occult philosophy, each of these 3 books is focused on one of the 3 worlds that he distinguished. He was thinking in terms of the Ptolemaic pre-Copernican cosmos. So in the center we have our world of the 3 elements. Everything that belongs to our world under the sphere of the moon, the sublunar sphere, is treated in this first book. Then his second book treats everything that exists above the sphere of the moon, but underneath the sphere of the fixed stars. And the third book is about everything that exists beyond the fixed stars, and that is the world of the divine, of angels and the divine realities. So 3 books focusing on our own world, on the celestial world, and on the divine world. Now it is known that Agrippa was exposed to Hermetic literature during his early Italian period, which was from 1509 to 1518. We know that he read the Hermetic literature. But interestingly enough, scholars have entirely overlooked the central importance of Lazarelli's Crater Hermetis to Agrippa's mature worldview. Reference to a Hermetic text have been noted, but it has not been noted that Agrippa read the Hermetic literature entirely through the glasses, so to speak, of Lodovico Lazarelli's Crater Hermetis. He had read Lodovico's Crater Hermetis, not in the original, which was in manuscripts, but in the edition that had been published by Lefebvre d'Etaples. That's the edition I showed earlier of 1505, where Lefebvre d'Etaples gives an abridged version of the Crater Hermetis. That is what Agrippa had read. In 1509, Agrippa met, and he was still quite young at that time, he met with Johannes Tritemius, who was a very recognized author, widely recognized author on the magical and occult sciences. He met him in Würzburg, and the two talked about the need to restore the reputation of magic. Magic, they agreed, was seen as a dark art that was associated with demonic influences, etc. But in fact, the true magic, according to Agrippa and Tritemius, was a divine science that had been taught by the ancients and that should be revived in the modern world. So that was their project, and in 1510, so one year later already, Agrippa had produced the first draft of his book on occult philosophy. At that moment it was still 1 volume, but this was the book in which he hoped to show to his readers the true nature of magic. And the true goal of magic, according to him and Tritemius, was purification and interior elevation of the human mind to the divine sphere. True magic would show us how to rise from this lower material world through the celestial spheres to the divine worlds up above. That was the true goal of magic. There are a few references to Lazzarelli in this work, but in his later writings of the Italian period, you see that the Lazzarellian interpretation really grows on him and becomes more and more important. In 1515, Agrippa was in Pavia, and there at the university he was lecturing on Ficino's Pimander, Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. We do not have the lecture texts themselves anymore, they have been lost, but we still have the introduction to these lectures, and we can learn quite a lot from it. The thesis that I'm going to defend here is that in fact we can learn from those lectures that Lazzarelli's work was really growing on Agrippa's mind, and that Lazzarelli's Crater Hermetis had become the lens, so to speak, through which Agrippa was reading the Hermetic writings. as I said earlier, if you read Ficino's translation itself, then it is not really clear from it what the true message of the Hermetica is. Lazzarelli had understood it much better, and Agrippa was using Lazzarelli as his guide, so to speak, for understanding the true message of the Pimander of Ficino. One thing he says in this introduction is that the Pimander, quote, instructs us about the knowledge of ourselves, so that's gnosis, self-knowledge, the ascent of the intellect, arcane prayers, the unity with God, and the sacrament of regeneration or rebirth. Now this is almost an exact summary of the Crater Hermetis by Lazzarelli. Then there is in this text of 1515 a frankly quite bizarre story about the true genealogy of wisdom. And I have to explain why this story is a bit bizarre and why he wrote it down. Lazzarelli had said the true wisdom started with Hermes, and from there it was passed on to Moses. We've seen that before. Everything starts with Hermes. Now, when Lefebvre d'Étaples in this edition of 1505 reprinted Lazzarelli's Crater, he was worried about this, because if Hermes is earlier than Moses, it means that the biblical revelation might be dependent on a pagan sage. That is very problematic from a Christian perspective, and therefore he changed the text. And instead of saying Hermes was the first, Lefebvre says some people have suggested that Hermes might be the first. So he changes the text, and that is what Agrippa read. However, there is very good reason to assume that Agrippa in Pavia met Symphorian Champier, whom I mentioned earlier. That is the guy who in 1507 published a complete edition of all the Hermetic writings, including the 3 treatises that Lazzarelli had translated. So this was a specialist. Agrippa was in Pavia, Symphorian Champier was in the same place, and Champier had direct first-hand knowledge about Lazzarelli and Correggio, knowledge that was transmitted orally, so to speak, and was not in writing. So it's very likely that Champier actually told Agrippa about Lazzarelli's actual opinions and his actual opinion that Hermes was the earliest one. So, in spite of Lefebvre's change of the text, Agrippa probably had access to Lazzarelli's actual meaning. And yeah, what did he do then with it? Well, he came up with a very strange compromise in his text. Agrippa says, yes, Hermes is older than Moses, like Lazzarelli said. At the same time, he was aware that this was problematic because biblical message then became dependent on a pagan sage. And so he adds something. He says, yes, Hermes is older than Moses, but Hermes was a grandson of Abraham. Now, this is a strange invention, of course, but it actually meant that Abraham was even older than Hermes. So Hermes was dependent on Abraham, and therefore the true wisdom has sources that ultimately go back to biblical patriarchs. So this is the way he tries to solve the problem that Lazzarelli presents him with. Furthermore, Agrippa adopts Lazzarelli's views about Poimaneris and Christ, and I give another quotation which is really quite amazing. This new interpretation of Lazzarelli is adopted very explicitly here by Agrippa. He says, thrice great Pimander Mercurius, mind of divine power, that is to say, our Lord, the crucified Nazarene Jesus Christ, who is the true Pimander, who is the messenger of great counsel, illuminates our mind with the true light, whom we profess to be truly God and truly man, the father of regeneration, and whom we expect as the judge of the coming age. So he very explicitly adopts Lazzarelli's completely innovative and creative idea that Pimander and Jesus Christ are one and the same. This is quite remarkable because you could get into trouble for making statements like these. And nevertheless, Agrippa made them. After this, there are some other works that Agrippa has written. A dialogue on man, which again is permeated with Lazzarellian ideas, but you have to really know Lazzarelli's work very well to recognize them. And here he makes a very strong opposition, again, between, on the one hand, carnal generation, sexual reproduction, and on the other hand, spiritual generation, the higher rebirth of the spirit and of the mind. These are two different things that he opposes to one another. Then in a later work of 1516 on the 3 ways of knowing God, and that's a completely preserved text that we still have, we see again Lateralis' notion of a progress from paganism, Hermes, to Judaism, Moses, according to Agrippa, to the gospel, Christ. From Hermes to Moses to Christ. From paganism to Judaism to Christianity. That is the grand framework that we find in Lazzarelli and which is adopted entirely by Agrippa here. He talks about a hermetic ascent of the human soul through divine generation or regeneration, rebirth, leading to reunion with the divine powers. And I give a short quotation from this text. Agrippa writes, "Thus you will come to understand the excellence of your own essence, and you will rise up out of the body, free from yourself and from all the things of the senses, ascending absolutely and purely, to fly to that transcendent and most shining darkness where God dwells." This is a reference to Dionysius the Areopagite. "And having been received among the powers, you shall enjoy God, and henceforth, begetting a divine offspring, you will procreate for God and not for yourself." Again, this theme of a higher form of sexual generation, procreation, bringing forth of spiritual beings, of souls. The true reborn human being can create souls, can procreate souls, just as God can create souls. Again, this is a purely Lateralian theme, which is not found anywhere else in the literature, as far as I know. So you see, in the whole Italian period of Agrippa, he is not just reading the Hermetic literature, he's actually reading Lazzarelli, and he's adopting all Lazzarelli's Christian interpretations of the Hermetic literature. Finally, we reach then 1533, De Occulta Philosophia Libri Tres, the 3 books of occult philosophy, his famous work. And there also you find the same message. It is very interesting to look at this because De Occulta Philosophia has very often been seen as a kind of work, a compilation of a lot of traditional materials with little or no originality. And many scholars have said there's nothing new in this work. There is no real message, there's no real Agrippa message that's to be found there. But actually, if you are aware of Lazzarelli's work and the way he interprets Christianity and the Hermetic writings, then you find that there is actually a very distinct message in De Occulta Philosophia, but it's there in an encoded form. And if you are not aware of a couple of backgrounds in Lazzarelli and the Hermetic literature, you will not see it. You have to know the key in order to decode this message. Now, I will not be able here to go into all the details of how this Hermetic Lazzarellian message is encoded in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. It's a very technical matter. Those of you who are interested can find the information in a few titles that will be mentioned at the very end of this webinar. So you will find them there and you can read the details there. Because in these kind of texts in the Renaissance, it's often the case that, well, as they say, the devil is in the details. It's really, and in this case, the Hermetic truth is in the details. You have to read very carefully, look at single words and formulations in order to find out. And I cannot go into that matter of detail here. You will have to read that. But what it comes down to is that if we read Agrippa's work through the lenses of Lazzarellian Hermetism, then we have to revise some of the assumptions that are current about Agrippa's work. Many scholars have argued that, according to Agrippa, it is through magic that human beings get access to the divine. So, through magical methods, you reach God. That is not at all what Agrippa is actually saying. He's saying the opposite. It is through mystical ascent, through spiritual regeneration, through the attainment of gnosis and the attainment of unity with God, through these means and not through magic, it is the case that human beings come to participate in God's own powers. And then once you unify yourself with God, then you have enormous powers. But this is not through magic, but it is actually through participating in the powers of God, God himself. So you can do what God can do. You can create souls and you can do the most incredible things. So what Agrippa is ultimately proclaiming is that through spiritual unification with God, we can do something that's even better than magic. There's a quotation that will have to stand for the whole argument here. Somewhere he says, I quote, "Nobody has such powers, but he who has gained control over the elements, has overcome nature, has transcended the heavens and the angels, and attains to the divine archetype itself, as a co-operator of which he can indeed do anything." So the regenerated human being who has been reborn and been unified with God can do anything. Anything is possible for him. What this is all about, ultimately, is deification. The process through which a human being literally becomes divine, comes to participate in God himself, and becomes a divine human being. According to Lazzarelli, and also according to Agrippa, this was the original nature of the human being. Originally, man, being created by God, participated in God's powers and was a kind of divine entity. Through the fall of man in paradise, we lost those powers, and through the Hermetic regeneration, we can regain them and again come to participate in our original divine being and become like gods on earth. This is what Lazzarelli was preaching. That is what Agrippa was preaching as well. So I come to my conclusions, and I just would like to recapitulate the main points I've been making in this webinar. First of all, sadly, it has to be said that the Hermetic tradition that we read about in Francis Yates' famous book never existed. We have to be thankful to our work, but it is a work from about half a century ago, and scholarship has progressed, and we have come to conclusions about Hermetism that falsify most of the things that Francis Yates claimed. The real Hermetic tradition actually does exist as a subset of Platonic Orientalism. So the general thing is Platonic Orientalism, this idea of an ancient wisdom through the ages, starting in the Orient. You have a Zoroastrian form, you have a Mosaic form, and you have a Hermetic form. And that is what we have been talking about in this webinar. The central figure of this Hermetic interpretation was the forgotten figure of Lodovico Lazzarelli. Lazzarelli had understood the Hermetic message better than anyone else, better than the great Ficino, better than any of his contemporaries. He really knew what was there. However, he Christianized it thoroughly. He read everything through Christian lenses and came up with a Christian form of Hermetism, which is of course different in that respect from the original writings, which have no Christian influences at all. Furthermore, Lazzarelli introduced an innovative doctrine of progress. It's not the case that we have lost touch with the ancient wisdom and there has been a process of decline from wisdom towards our own forgetfulness of wisdom. No, it's actually different. It started with Hermes, with a divine revelation to Hermes Trismegistus through Poimandres. This message was partly misunderstood by Hermes himself. Then we moved to a higher state with the birth of Jesus Christ, who actually was Poimandres. Christians after the birth of Christ are able to understand our Hermetic message in a way that Hermes himself could not. And now, according to Lazzarelli, and this is something that Agrippa knew nothing about, but according to Lazzarelli, now with Correggio, Giovanni da Correggio, Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio, the Christian and the Hermetic message have been reunited, so to speak, in his person. Poimandres, alias Christ, has returned to earth as Giovanni Mercurio da Correggio. That was Lazzarelli's conviction, and that is not in the Crater Hermetis, and Agrippa could not know this, unless he had heard some rumors about this from people like Symphorien Champier. But what we do find in Lazzarelli and Agrippa is the doctrine of progress, from paganism through Judaism to Christianity, and through a unification of of Hermetism and Christianity in his own time. This Lateralian tradition survived thanks to Lefebvre d'établis edition, once again, 1505. If Lefebvre had not published this text, the whole Lateralian tradition might have gotten lost entirely, and the text might still be lying in a manuscript form somewhere in an Italian library. But thanks to this, it survived. It was picked up by Cornelius Agrippa, and it became the hidden secrets, and I do not hesitate to call it like that, the hidden secrets of Agrippa's famous work. Lateralian Hermetism is the real heart and the core of what Agrippa's work was all about. I would dare to go as far as this. Now the question then there remains, did this Hermetic tradition survive further? I think it did, but there is a lot of research that still needs to be done along these lines. It is necessary to actually know Lateralist writings extremely well in order to recognize the influence in later authors. And this kind of research still needs to be done. So we have found the origins of the real Hermetic tradition, but the complete story still has to be written.